I'd like to give a shout out to Bryan Cranston and Bill Maher for their podcast discussion, where they were discussing why critical race theory should be taught in schools. Bryan Cranston, of course, who doesn't really know anything about it, and it's obvious by his depiction of what it is, says that it's essential that we teach critical race theory in schools. That's strange, because I was told over and over again they weren't actually teaching it in schools, but sure. Here's the news. Laguna Beach ER doctor, 58, is sent flying as Lexus driving accountant, 39, smashes into his bike and then stabs him to death. Witnesses claim the suspect shouted white privilege slurs. Okay, I don't know what that means, but I saw this story. I was reading the news, and the initial reporting didn't mention the white privilege stuff. What it said was that a car rammed a man riding his bike at high speed. There's video of it. It's horrifying. Jumps out of the car and then just proceeds to stab the man repeatedly. Witnesses then subdued the man, and he was apprehended. Apparently, there's no known connection between the two individuals. It seemed like a random killing. And I thought to myself as I read the story, like, wow, that's crazy. No idea why that would happen. You know, the truth is, my friends, I read a lot of news all day, every day, and I only give you the things that I think are the most important or interesting. There are a lot of stories I typically will read and be like, oh, well, this was one of them. Then an updated report came out that the murderer was screaming the suspect, white privilege slurs. And I said, okay, now we know the motive. The motive is a racist man ran down a white ER doctor and murdered him in a hate crime. I mean, that's the only explanation. You're screaming slurs. And this is one of the reasons why I think critical race theory is evil and wrong. Of course, you get the Mountain Bailey. The leftists and the Democrats will say they're not teaching critical race theory in schools. It's college level discourse. It's not. What they're doing is critical race applied principles, as we've often mentioned on Timcast IRL. That is the application of the praxis or critical race praxis as opposed to theory. They are actually teaching children to live in a world where they are oppressed by evil oppressors. Well, look. It is true. You can go back in time and look at all the horrible things that were done in this country on the basis of race or with race as a strong basis for why they were doing it. Yeah, I was wrong. Glad that we moved past that. But we're not talking about a world in which one day you flick a switch and then all of a sudden racial tensions are gone. In fact, the only thing we're really seeing from critical race theory is the expansion of racial tensions that I want to go away. But you see, the left, they follow people like Ibram Kendi, whose real name is like Brian, I guess, but he calls himself Ibram X Kendi. So anyway, this Brian guy says that the only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination, or something like that. Basically, these people live and breathe racial tensions and conflict. I think you can understand why I take issue with that. Coming from my family, I'd prefer it if race wasn't a determinant in how we treated each other. But of course, thanks to the likes of Bryan Cranston and other celebrities who push psychotic white supremacist ideology, and yes, absolutely, critical race theory is white supremacist, then we end up with this. I told you the story, but I'll give you some more of the details and we'll read. Dr. Michael Mamone, 58, was cycling on the PCH, the Pacific Coast Highway in California, when he was run over by a white Lexus, which sped through a red light at an intersection on Wednesday around 3 p.m. The driver of the vehicle, Van Roy Evans Smith, 39, then got out of his car and stabbed the cyclist multiple times in the back, with brave bystanders tackling to the ground. Bravo to those bystanders, because so many people often will just ignore this stuff. And this guy had a knife. Witnesses say, and a gun. He was holding a BB gun when he approached Dr. Mamone and was screaming racial slurs about white privilege. Here we go, baby. Shocking video shows the moment Smith, a trained accountant, careened into the cyclist, with police claiming the pair were complete strangers. That's right, my friends. In all likelihood, this was a hate crime. I'm not going to show the video, man. It's brutal, you know. Video shows the Lexus appearing to speed through the intersection, throwing the doctor and bike in the air. Smith, who is described as a black man on his arrest record, can then be seen walking over Dr. Mamone and attacking him again before witnesses drag him away. Orange County Sheriff's Department said investigators were unaware of the slurs and added that there was no known relationship or motive. It is unclear if the doctor was traveling to or from work during the incident, with friends saying he regularly cycled to the hospital as he lived close by. Authorities discovered the doctor laying in the intersection suffering from severe injuries. They recovered a knife at the scene. Despite witnesses claiming they saw a gun of some kind, officials have not confirmed if any firearms were recovered. Well, it was a BB gun. Sergeant Michael Woodruff also praised the witnesses. Smith, a father of two, was arrested, has been charged with murder, and is set to appear in court later on Friday. He remains in custody at the Intake Release Center in Orange County. How about we just call it what it is? A hate crime. That's what it is. So I'll tell you why I think stuff like this happens. And I'll tell you that I think it's getting worse. And I'll tell you that I've talked about this for a while. Critical race theory. For those that aren't familiar, you must not watch my videos, but, if you're not familiar, it is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the book Critical Race Theory, where she says that basically Karl Marx, he's right about the oppressed and the oppressor, but he doesn't understand North American race politics because, in Europe, everybody's kind of white to a certain degree. I mean, there's different ethnicities, but he doesn't understand. He thinks it's if you have money or you don't. Well, that's not necessarily true. Kimberly Crenshaw argues that race is the determinant factor in the oppressed versus the oppressor. And in the U.S., if you are a white person, you are an oppressor. And if you are a non-white person, you are oppressed. That's critical race theory. From there, several scholars then come out and start writing curriculum and creating subsidiary ideologies, intersectional feminism, etc. They then bring these things to schools and talk about white privilege. And they have there's a book called Not My Idea, which depicts a white hand with a devil tail and goat's feet with the whiteness contract. It talks about how you as a white person are stealing from everyone else. I remember one time I was skateboarding. This is maybe 15 years ago. 15, yeah, maybe 16. Maybe 15 years ago. And this Hispanic guy I knew, just one day, we're skating. I'm doing a kickflip backside tail slide on this little ledge, just getting my moves in. And he starts complaining about how white people are evil and how they steal everything. It's the only thing they've ever done. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, bro, we're playing skate, do a nollie flip. And he was just going off. And I'm like, this is creepy stuff, dude. When someone comes to you and starts ranting about how one race is evil, it is creepy stuff that leads us to very, very bad places. I don't care if you're talking about white people or black people or Asian people or Jewish people, Latino people. Don't single out people because of the color of their skin or their fathers and mothers, and then just determine that they're evil. This is critical race theory. I'm going to show you a video. I can't play the video. I can only tell you what it is because it's horrifying. It's going viral right now. Jack Posobiec tweets 9-year-old girl in the school bus in South Florida. I can't show you the video. I'm sorry. You're going to have to watch it if you want to go watch it. Find it on Twitter. Jack Posobiec tweeted it out. It's a 9-year-old white girl being mercilessly beaten by two young black boys. And this is what you get with critical race theory. You take a kid and tell him over and over and over again that it's they're the bad guys. And again, I don't care who they is supposed to refer to. I don't care if you're talking about white people, black people, Asians, or Jewish people, because everybody has their group of people that they blame for their problems. And that's why I've often said the anti-Semitism, the people who are constantly screaming about Jewish people, no different to me than screaming about white privilege. Literally the same thing. Blaming a group of people based on their ethnic background is meaningless. And so they mercilessly beat this child, and I think they're trying to kill her because the dude's just pounding nonstop a 9-year-old. Yo, in horrifying circumstances, a single punch to the head could kill someone. I hope y'all know that. Because there are too many stories where two guys get into a fight, one guy punches the other guy dies. And then he's like, I didn't mean it. It doesn't matter. You hit him, you killed him. This little girl, man. And the crazy thing, I guess the parents said they filed a complaint about bullying. Get your kid out of that school. Are you kidding? They tried to kill her. You know what, man? Our society deserves what it gets. Look, if you are hearing that your child was mercilessly beaten and to the point, and it's filmed and you can watch it, And you're like, well, honey, go back to school tomorrow. We'll file a report. Yeah, okay, well, then your kid's going to die. And I'm not trying to be cold. Literally, they tried to kill your kid. Get your kids out of these schools before it's too late. With the indoctrination, with the crime, with the chaos. I just say, get your kid out of these schools, man. It's time to homeschool. It's time to leave the cities. It's time to go to the country, buy some chickens, some goats, maybe an alpaca or two, whatever you can handle. Figure out how to farm or whatever. You know, we had a garden. We had a big garden. And we made the mistake of planting all the tomatoes at once. You're supposed to plant them 1 week at a time so that they don't all ripen at the exact same time, because then we had like 100 tomatoes we couldn't eat. But don't worry, we gave them to the chickens. Chickens loved it. It was really great. Once we were done with most of the harvesting, we opened a little door and the chickens all ran out and just started annihilating all what was left of the vegetables and plants that we didn't want, pooping all over the place, tilling the land. And then when we did remodeling of the front and concreted over, all that dirt that got scooped up was like next spring was bustling with life because of all the chicken crap that was in it. It's funny how that works. Anyway, I digress. You know, chickens are awesome. You got to be self-sufficient, man. This is the kind of stuff that's happening in cities. I believe you look at this story and it is a black racist targeting and killing a random white man for no reason other than his race. I do not want to live in a world where anyone is being attacked based on their race. But that's critical race theory for you. From Fox News, Bill Maher, Bryan Cranston battle over critical race theory in podcast debate, essential to be teaching. People like Bryan Cranston are a good actor, by the way, but very, very dangerous people. They garner influence. Imagine if I was influential in like nuclear physics, even though I had no idea anything about nuclear physics, the origins, the scientists. I had a cursory understanding, like Albert Einstein and Oppenheimer and things like that, and Werner von Braun. And then I went to the community and I was like, I think we should take the uranium cores and we got to put them in schools. And then people are like, dude, that's going to be really bad. No, listen, look, I'm a famous talking personality and we need to put uranium cores in schools. People would be like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever. That's how I feel when they do stuff like this. You've got people like Bryan Cranston who have no idea what they're talking about, being like, teach people the history. And I'm like, okay, look. That's not what they're doing. They're telling young non-white people that they are they're enslaved and oppressed by their white peers. But I assure you, Oprah Winfrey has substantially more power than a homeless white veteran sitting on the ground begging for scraps. But they would tell you otherwise. Because he's white, he's an oppressor. And so reparations need to be given to people, even if they are worth millions or billions of dollars. Actor Bryan Cranston appeared on comedian Bill Maher's Club Random podcast Saturday, where the two began hotly debating whether critical race theory should be taught in schools. It's 400 effing years that we've dealt with this, and our country still has not taken responsibility or accountability, Cranston said. You see, this is why I say he's a dangerous, psychotic individual. If somebody was advocating for putting uranium cores like active critical mass in schools, I'd say you are psychotic. That is dangerous. You are an unwell person. I think, he says 400 years, we've never taken accountability. I don't know. I think like all of the dead people in the Civil War may be that accountability. I think perhaps the war that was fought, not entirely to end slavery for the most part, to stop destruction of this country, but it was rooted in stopping the expansion of slavery, and ultimately it led to the end of slavery. I think maybe like, I don't know, all those dead people was accountability. Imagine your great-great-great-grandfather and your great-great-great-great-uncle died fighting in the Civil War. Imagine they were abolitionists who said they would fight to see the horror that is slavery finally ended. And they left with their wives, but a single child each. You grew up in poverty because your struggling great-great-great-great-grandmother had a difficult time raising a child after her husband died in the war. But she made ends meet, and she crawled from nothing with no education, doing what she could. And then her child grew up and struggled and had nothing and no education. lived in the dirt. And today, you live in a small trailer in rural West Virginia where you make only a few $1,000s per year, but it's enough to cover the basic necessities, and you struggle. And they tell you you are the oppressor. It's your fault because you're white and you've not taken accountability. And here you are suffering. Meanwhile, there are other people of similar circumstance who are millionaires. Meanwhile, there are people who are slave owners whose children are in the poorhouse. There are people whose ancestors were slave owners who are celebrities. There are people who were enslaved whose descendants go on to become some of the most powerful people in the world. I do not see how at this point, 160 some odd years later, that we can actually quantify who is owed what based on skin color. One day they're giving out reparations and a white man walks up and says, look at that. My great-great-great-great-great-grandmother actually was a slave, married a white man. It was taboo at the time. And then that kid married a white woman who married a white woman who married a white. Turns out I'm 132nd or 164th. I got an ancestor who was enslaved. I deserve it. It just doesn't make sense. But this is Bryan Cranston for you. When Maher questioned what America needs to take responsibility for, Cranston insisted for the history of the systemic racism that's in this country. He says, well, I mean, for one thing, he says, what can be done? I think critical race theory is essential to be teaching. Maher asked him, well, what do you mean by that? And he says, critical race theory, I mean, it's one of those catch-all terms. If you mean we should honestly teach our past, of course. If you mean more of what the 1619 book says, which is that it's just the essence of America and that we are irredeemable, that's just wrong. Yes, I agree with that, Cranston said. See, that shows you right there, Cranston does not know what he's actually saying. Critical race theory is not teaching the history of racism. We do that. Critical race theory is an ideology. It's a religion. The discussion continued as Cranston claimed there needs to be further action to teach our past and be honest about this country's history. Most schools are doing that, Maher replied. Cranston said in Florida, they want to do away with critical race theory in a lot of other states because sometimes it veers off into things that are not really appropriate in schools, Maher said. Maher specifically took issue with introducing ideas about race that are inappropriate for the kids that age who can't understand it and telling 5-year-olds that you're either an oppressor or someone who is oppressed. Cranston ultimately agreed. You see, these are influential people who don't know what they're talking about. He says, okay, so common sense would govern that. Common sense is what's lacking in this country, Maher replied. During the podcast, Maher did agree with the concept of systemic racism, suggesting the Second Amendment has roots in racist state ideology. Quote, it's like, for example, why the Second Amendment really has to do with in a country where you are keeping a hostile people in chains, you needed guns to keep the lid on that. So that's a lot to do with why other countries don't have a Second Amendment the way we do. Bill Maher is wrong. The Second Amendment was about the right to keep and bear arms to defend yourself, primarily because they just fought against a government that tried to take away their guns. It explicitly said you can keep guns even if you're, I forgot what it exactly said, that even if you don't serve in the military, you can keep and bear arms. They were not thinking about slavery. The issue was they got rid of that because they were like, well, we do have conscription. We may need to conscript people, so maybe we shouldn't say that. People may construe that as to say they could own the weapon and you can't conscript them. No, they thought that conscription was important. And I guess back then, I got to be honest, kind of was. That's the challenge. Man, we in this country don't like the draft. We've had it for a while. We got rid of it. It's still kind of there, but, in stasis. But imagine back then, your country gets invaded and they say, you will come help us fight or else. Yeah, the threat to your existence, it was there. Most of these young men wanted to. And so they did. And that's why we have the Second Amendment. The idea of the founding fathers was that everybody would be armed and you would not need, for the most part, standing armies unless you're in a time of war. And then they would convene the army and they would bring the militia out. And the point was, if everybody had a gun, then nobody could conquer you. They wanted you to be armed and be free. Of course, the woke left and these other crackpots want to spread these ideas that it's really about stopping slaves. Well, it's true in some places. The police departments were formed as remnants of slave-catching patrols. That's true. It's crazy, right? Basically, what happened is they got a bunch of guys together, gave them badges, and says, if the slaves escape, go catch them. Then once they started getting rid of it, and it started, after the Civil War and stuff, they said, well, this group, they can enforce the laws anyway. But the sheriff and law enforcement typically existed, and militia would deal with crimes Police in general emerged from a practice in Europe, which came over to the United States, which you had a group of people in an area to enforce the law. You typically had like a sheriff and a deputy. They were elected and they would enforce the law. Now you have appointed, and it creates all sorts of problems in my opinion. So I think it should be elected. But look, the gist of this segment is just go back to this story. It's horrifying, man. It's a hate crime. He ran this guy down. And I think the reason he did it was because of critical race theory, because people are being told to believe that they are the oppressed and they must fight back. And it's based on race, you know what? And it's convenient. You've got people running massive corporations and they don't want anyone fighting them. That's what Occupy Wall Street was going to bring about until it got co-opted by this. Now they're fighting each other in the streets. There you go. That's what they want, the division. It's a sad state of affairs. And I can only imagine it'll get worse. And that video of that little girl being mercilessly beaten is horrifying. Get your kids out of these schools. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. over at youtube.com/Timcast. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.